I thank it. Leave's granted. I give the call to the Minister.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people have loved the land, skies and waters of our region for a millennia. As we reflect on the health of our environment today, we acknowledge their stewardship of our lands by all of Australia's First Nations people and celebrate their elders past, present and emerging. In acknowledging country, I also acknowledge a fundamental truth, that our First Nations people, who enjoy such rich and meaningful connection with their country, have much to lose from unchecked climate change. From the visible and the tangible, from the rising sea levels and natural disasters impacting on the people of the Torres Strait Islands, to increasing temperatures in remote communities, to the less visible but deeply meaningful, the impact on the culture, ritual and increasing difficulty of living on country for our First Nations people. Today I reaffirm the Albanese government's commitment to work with and learn from First Nations people in tackling the challenge of climate change. We will do this through a voice to Parliament. We will do this through the development of the First Nations Clean Energy Strategy funded in our first budget, which will be co-designed with First Nations communities. We'll do this through our remote community microgrids policy and through the Torres Strait Island Centre of Community Excellence, which are also both funded in our first budget. It was an honour to meet with Torres Strait Islander elders on their country in my first weeks as Climate Change Minister, and I've met with them on several occasions since, and it's an honour to have some here in the House with us today. Mr Deputy Speaker, there was once a time when advocates of climate action had to warn of the impacts of climate change into the distant future. No longer. Climate change has moved from a theory to a prediction to a lived reality. The truth is, no Australian is spared from the impact of climate change, from the cities to the regions. Not the farmer working harder and harder amid more and more destructive disasters. Not the tourism worker in Queensland, whose livelihood comes from sharing the joys of the world's greatest coral reef. Not the communities subjected to seemingly never-ending cavalcades of bushfires, followed by floods again, all too dispiritingly soon. Our beautiful land has always been subject to natural disasters, but those disasters are becoming increasingly devastating, increasingly frequent, increasingly unnatural. Mr Deputy Speaker, as difficult as our current predicament is, it's still incumbent on us to be truthful and frank about how much worse it will be if we and the world don't act now. Our country was devastated by the Black Summer bushfires just a few years ago. But as frightening as that bushfire season was, the absence of action will see the temperatures and conditions of that year become normal by the 2040s and become a good year by the 2060s. Mr Deputy Speaker, we cannot let that happen. Changing rainfall and worsening heat will make our world-class agricultural sector less productive and harder to work. In fact, Mr Deputy Speaker, Australia is the developed country most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, including bushfires and floods, so the stakes are extremely high. Not acting would be an unforgivable act of intergenerational negligence. And Mr Deputy Speaker, while Australia has a lot to lose from climate change, as a good international citizen, we care deeply about our region and the impacts of climate change everywhere. Pakistan received 3 times the annual average rainfall in only 3 months this year, in May, June and July, inundating hundreds of villages, towns and districts. More than 1,700 people have died in those floods, including more than 600 young lives lost. Closer to home, our important neighbour Indonesia is the world's largest archipelago, with hundreds of millions of citizens living in low-lying areas exposed to sea level rises. And of course our Pacific neighbours are on the front line, and not just through rising sea levels. Natural disasters are taking an increasing toll on our friends and neighbours. Salt water is invading freshwater supplies. The lifestyles and economies of our Pacific neighbours face unprecedented threats. Indeed, threats that were, until now, unthinkable. I'm honoured to welcome so many Pacific ambassadors, high commissioners and community leaders here today, and I reiterate our government's support to work with them on the way forward. Mr Deputy Speaker, I give these examples not out of a sense of despondency, but out of a sense of urgency. Our country has wasted a decade, and we now don't have a second to waste. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm honoured to present the Albanese Government's first annual statement on climate change. Almost exactly 1 year ago today, the now Prime Minister and I released the climate change and energy policy of the then opposition. And 6 months ago, we received a mandate from the Australian people to implement that policy. And since then, we've been in the early stages of doing just that. Important in our agenda was the passage of the Climate Change Act, showing the world that Australia is open for business with a stable investment environment to unleash billions of dollars of renewable energy investment and zero emissions technology. And I thank the Parliament again for passing that Act. We are now just one of 22 countries to have legislated our climate change targets. We are, in that regard, international best practice. And of course, the Act requires today's statement. We want to be accountable, transparent and open about the opportunities, progress, stumbling blocks and challenges in meeting this, our most important national challenge. In line with this, I'm proud to table this statement and the accompanying advice of the Independent Climate Change Authority, the latest emissions projections, quarterly emissions update, and to do so in an open, accountable and transparent way. There are and will continue to be challenges, but our determination as a government, and I'm very confident as a country, is greater than any challenge. Australia's increased target is to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030. There are those who call for more. I understand that sentiment, and as we've said many times, we see 43% as a floor, not a ceiling. But the documents I'm tabling today, including advice from the Independent Climate Change Authority, underline just what a substantial effort this 43% target requires. The previous government left their projected emissions reductions by 2030 at only 30%. The projections I'm releasing today show the actions and policies of this government so far have increased this projection to 40%. That is, we've lifted the outlook by a third in our first 6 months. And policies we received a mandate for and are working to implement will lift our result to at least 43%. To get on a credible path to net zero, you need to achieve a 43% reduction by 2030. This being the first day of the month, 2030 is now just 84 months away. 84 months is not a long time. As the Climate Change Authority advice makes clear, to achieve this target, we will need to achieve the same emissions reduction in the next 8 years that has been achieved in the last 18 years in total. Since 2009, Australia has decarbonised its economy at an average rate of 12 million tonnes of carbon a year. To achieve a 43% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050, this decarbonisation rate needs to be at least 17 million tonnes of carbon a year, a 40% increase. Increased dispatchable storage will also be essential. After 10 years, when 4 gigawatts of dispatchable generation left the grid and only 1 gigawatt of dispatchable capacity entered the market, we will need to install much more clean, dispatchable power in the coming 8 years. Mr Deputy Speaker, of course, this all comes in the shade of the biggest energy crisis ever to face the modern world, bigger than the oil crises of the 1970s. This statement is delivered at a time when climate change and energy prices are two of the most discussed topics in the world, at cabinet tables, at boardroom tables and at the dinner table. Our government's response is twofold. Short term, the measures will ensure Australian industry and businesses are shielded from the worst of Putin's weaponisation of energy, and a long-term plan to power our economy with the cheapest form of energy, renewable energy, and in turn to harness the economic opportunities which come with it. There are some who argue that the world crisis is a reason to slow the move to renewable energy. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the opposite is true. As the International Energy Agency puts it, and I quote, "The world is struggling with too little clean energy, not too much. Faster clean energy transitions would have helped moderate the impact of this crisis, and they represent the best way out of it." Mr. Deputy Speaker, we haven't wasted a day in beginning to implement the ambitious plan to achieve these goals. A third of Australia's emissions come from our electricity system. Over the next 8 years, we will need to transition our electricity system to 82% renewables from the current base of around 30%. The most important thing we can do is to rewire our nation, because the fact is there is no transition without transmission. In the first 6 months, we've made good progress with our Rewiring the Nation policy. Our first budget allocated the necessary $20 billion of investment. And importantly, we've finalised agreements for the first projects. The Marinus Link, which had been all talk for years, will now be a reality. These two cables between Tasmania and the mainland will see the Apple Isle move from being 100% renewables to 200% renewables, with the equivalent impact in a reduction of emissions of taking 1 million cars off our roads. Likewise, our investment in the link between Victoria and New South Wales, Kerrang Link, and the co-investments with the Victorian Government in renewable energy zones and offshore wind are vital to our efforts. And the government continues to work at a great pace on other Rewiring the Nation projects. In addition, the budget funded our commitment to 400 community batteries, and the program to roll this out will shortly be underway. The budget also abolished the failed Underwriting New Generation Investment program and replaced it with a new program to help finance new renewable energy storage. A new and cooperative approach around the table with my State and Territory Energy Minister colleagues has seen us strike an important national energy transformation partnership and, for the first time, write emissions reduction into our national energy objectives. And I'll be consulting with my State and Territory colleagues on a capacity investment mechanism in coming weeks. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, renewable energy alone won't meet our emission reduction target. We need a whole-of-economy response. In fact, industrial emitters are projected to overtake electricity generators as Australia's leading source of emissions. We won't reduce our emissions unless we reduce them from our top 200 industrial emitters. So we need to reform the safeguard mechanism, which governs emissions from our biggest industrial emitters. This process has commenced. Yesterday, I introduced legislation which enables credits to be provided to large industrial facilities which come in under their safeguard mechanism baseline, incentivising them to innovate and adopt emissions reduction technology. The next stage will see the release of the draft design of our reforms, which will be implemented by regulation. This follows the release of a comprehensive consultation paper for which we received more than 200 submissions. I'm not going to preempt the result of the draft design today, but I hope the release of today's projections provides additional context to the size of the task ahead of us and why we need every part of the economy to do their bit. I welcome the fact that around 70% of the facilities covered by the mechanism already have net zero commitments. The reform mechanism will be a good example of carefully calibrated policy designed in consultation with industry and business. When the old safeguard mechanism was so poorly designed, it allowed facilities to increase their emissions. It simply wasn't good enough. Business as usual can't be the usual business anymore. Businesses must step up and deliver on their commitments during this critical decade for climate action. Mr. Deputy Speaker, how we move around our wide country has a big impact on how much we emit. Our government inherited a situation in which just 2% of car sales are electric, 5 times below the international average. Last week, the Parliament passed our electric vehicle tax cut, cutting $9,000 a year from the cost to an Australian business of providing a $50,000 electric vehicle to employees. But there is much, much more to do. The budget funded our Driving the Nation investments in cleaner and cheaper transport, including a national electric vehicle charging network to roll out a fast charger once every 150 kilometres on our highways in partnership with the NRMA. and the Minister for Transport and I are now working through feedback to our National Electric Vehicle Strategy consultation paper, including consideration of fuel efficiency standards. Australia is in company with Russia as one of the only major economies without vehicle efficiency standards. And Australians are paying a price for that, with manufacturers sending efficient models to other countries that require them as a matter of law. We've been encouraged to see more than 100 organisations, including car makers, energy companies, transport operators, car clubs, businesses and unions, publicly back the government's electric vehicle strategy process, and we've noted their calls for fuel efficiency standards to be introduced. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, we know the work can't stop here. We're delivering solar banks to provide access to renewable energy to low-income families, and we're leading by transforming our own federal government to be net zero by 2030. We're also committed to practical actions in the land and agricultural sectors, driving abatement and incentives through carbon markets that have integrity and cut pollution. And we're returning our country to full international engagement and leadership in climate, just as we did in the last few weeks in COP27, but also through the Quad, through the G20 and through the Clean Energy Ministerial. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased with how much progress the government has made in our first 6 months. Pleased, but not satisfied. We've done a lot in a short time, but there's so much more to do. The government has a sense of urgency, a sense of passion and answers. But we don't have all the answers. We don't own all the wisdom. We are a government which listens. One of the things we promised to do is restore the role and resourcing of the Independent Climate Change Authority, a promise we've kept. And I'm pleased to today table the advice of the authority, as well as announce that we accept all their recommendations. In particular, the authority recommends that the government begin work on a plan to guide the nation's efforts towards achieving net zero, which we agree with and will prepare. The authority also points out that while technology exists to meet our 2030 targets, there are significant labour market and supply chain challenges as every country around the world strives to meet their targets. And we agree. Providing the training and investment in clean energy and decarbonising our workforce was a major focus of our Jobs and Skills Summit in July, and our policy of 10,000 new energy apprentices, which we are implementing, is a great start, but we know more needs to be done. Ensuring access to resources and supply chain has also been a key focus of my first 6 months as Minister, particularly my work with my fellow energy ministers from the Quad countries. But again, there's much more to do. We accept this advice from the Climate Change Authority that this will need an ongoing focus. In addition, Mr Deputy Speaker, while reducing emissions will always be the most important agenda, the fact is that the climate has already changed and will keep changing, and we must adapt. Right around the country, Australians are living with the consequences of climate change right now. So more leadership is necessary. We need a comprehensive plan for adaptation and climate risk assessment. And working closely with the states and territories, that's exactly what we will do. Because we don't have time to waste, to take advantage of the opportunities which come with climate action, especially for our regions. We must prepare and adapt and take advantage of the opportunities as well. Because Australia's regions experience some of the worst climate change impacts, but they also have the opportunity to be at the heart of our clean energy revolution. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, that's why regional Australia is at the core of our plans, to ensure that Australia takes advantage of the economic opportunities which come with climate action. It's why we've announced in the budget the creation of a net zero task force within the Cabinet. The task force will bring together perspectives from communities, states and territory governments, industries and unions to advise the government on ensuring that regional Australians are the first to benefit from Australia's transformation to become a renewable energy powerhouse. Because while regional Australia is currently at the heart of powering Australia, it will also be at the heart of our clean energy future. Those who demonise renewable energy ignore the immense potential for energy industries in rural and regional Australia. New opportunities which will bring jobs and new investment and drive down power bills at the same time. Mr Deputy Speaker, in this report to the House, I've emphasised the costs of climate change and the fact that we are already facing those costs, and they'll get worse if we don't act. These are real and serious. It's too late to avoid the climate emergency. It's our job to act with urgency to avoid the worst of the emergency. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm also hugely optimistic about our future, because the world's climate emergency really is Australia's jobs opportunity. Renewable energy superpower, green energy export powerhouse, electricity factory of our region, whatever your preferred term, Australia has this potential, but only with the right policies. Policies this government is implementing, especially in our regions, the regions that have powered Australia for so long. For decades, Australians were told by some that action on climate change would cost jobs. This was always a lie, and it has never been more of a lie than today. The deniers and the delayers will continue their baseless predictions, but Australians know better. We can have electric vehicles and enjoy the weekend. We can reduce methane and have barbecues on the weekend. Renewable energy is the answer to this crisis, not the cause. Our country had a decade of denial and delay, more than enough of it. The stakes are high. The cost of inaction is huge. But the dividend of action is enormous. Ambition is important. Careful plans, implemented with alacrity to achieve that ambition, is even more important. Our government has hit the ground running with a strong agenda of climate action. How we have begun is how we intend to continue. I began this speech by talking about the stewardship of our country by our First Nations people. Caring for country and climate in this changing world is now more important for all of us than it ever has been. And it's a task this government joins in partnership with communities, business and our entire country with passion. Mr Deputy Speaker, I table and present a copy of the Annual Climate Change Statement 2022, the Climate Change Authority's first annual progress report, Australia's Emissions Reduction Projections Report 2022 and quarterly update of Australia's National Greenhouse Inventory Report, June 2022. Mr Deputy Speaker, I commend these documents to the House. I commend the annual statement on climate change to the House. Now the real work continues. Thank you.